Greetings, stranger. Welcome to Hoag's Rickets and Rumples here in Diobel. If you have come for the gaming tables, then I hope the dice and cards are ever in your favour. But first, perhaps, you would care to join me in the parlour and hear my tale of the Xulgaths, one of the most ancient and misunderstood ancestries ever to grace Golarion. Indeed, I would wager you may not have come across the term before, let alone a specimen attached to the name. Well, that would be because us surface dwellers tend to refer to the creatures by the name Troglodytes, meaning hole dwellers. What an astoundingly superficial designation for a fascinating and surprisingly sophisticated civilization. Or the shadow of one, anyway. Come, take a seat, and let me tell you about the Xulgaths, who, some believe, constructed one of the world's first empires, far underground in the secret places of Orv, the deepest known layer of the Darklands beneath our feet. A typical Xulgath on first glance may resemble a larger kobold, albeit one far darker and fouler than the surface-dwelling dragon worshippers. Most Xulgaths stand around 5 feet tall, bearing grey or black scales over a taut reptilian frame. This is perfect natural camouflage for their environments, which are the endless passages and caverns of the Darklands' upper layers. They have rather long necks for their size, ending in gaunt faces supported by strong, snapping jaws. Their eyes are large and slitted, and seem to bulge from within their skulls, which lends Xulgaths an unjustified air of frailty and emaciation. In reality, however, they are stronger, faster, and hardier than most humans, though they are also noticeably less intelligent. Xulgaths amongst themselves speak a Draconic dialect that sounds harsh to surface dwellers, but not to the point of unintelligibility, and many clutches also speak Undercommon for parleying with foreign Darkland parties. Despite their impressive array of natural weapons, Xulgaths prefer to use stone tools, and their craftsmen have developed a unique form of magical reinforcement called inflection, which can give their weapons an unexpected durability and talent that renders them closer to steel than to cavern rock. The art of inflection hints at something greater than would be inferred from witnessing a single Xulgath, whose ragged clothing and armor otherwise imply a rather primitive existence. Indeed, adventuring parties that venture down into the Darklands' upper layer, called Navoth, rarely experience much that would afford them any other conclusion, given that most Xulgath cultural development was abandoned many thousands of years ago in deeper caverns. In fact, the so-called Troglodytes are best known among the mercenaries and traders who risk journeys below Golarion's surface for being accompanied at all times by an overpowering stench. This olfactory assault betrays a Xulgath's presence long before a creature is witnessed, though it does not become truly sickening until one finds oneself within spitting distance of the culprit. It is often rumoured that this stench is the result of the Xulgath's ignorance of all bathing techniques and other hygienic measures, but as is often the case when surface and Darkland cultures collide, this is actually a misnomer that hides a far more fascinating truth. First, let us pull back the veil on Xulgath ecology, for these creatures are not, as the old caravan master on the next table is wont to tell you, spawned from the Darklands' cavern walls themselves, but rather created through straightforward copulation of male and female specimens. However, it is true to say that the majority of Xulgaths, and particularly those living close to the surface, will attack non-Xulgaths on sight, because their habits are violent and cruel, even by the standards of the underworld. It is therefore quite difficult to negotiate entry into their camps and dwellings, which I find a great pity, as they are quite unique spaces. Xulgaths organize themselves into extended family units, called clutches, named for their habit of incubating eggs in dedicated spawning chambers called warrens. The smallest clutch may be no more than a handful of individuals, or even simply a mated pair, but the largest can span dozens of chambers and account for many hundreds of reptiles. It is unusual, but not unknown, for clutches to accrue even greater numbers, but once a cadet branch of the family line becomes too distinct genetically speaking, its members will break away, sometimes violently, to start a new clutch elsewhere. Strength is the most important metric to a Xulgath clutch, and the leadership of a tribe almost always falls on the mightiest individual. However, how strength is measured does show remarkable variance from clutch to clutch, with some, especially nearer the surface, relying on physical power, and others instead turning to piety and divine or occult prowess. I have found that some combination of martial and magical might normally rules the day, with Xulgath leaders, who are referred to as devourers, normally displaying competence in both areas. Incidentally, this title refers to the enduring habit of consuming the flame-purified flesh of fallen foes, for they believe that souls can be destroyed by fire, and that their essences can then be transferred into the consumer. Fire is a critically important element of Xulgath culture, which is quite unusual within the Darklands. After all, smoke will quickly choke the inhabitants of even large caverns, and its noxious fumes disperse much more slowly without a sky to hold them or winds to cleanse them. Yet the Xulgaths use their cunning and expertise in stoneworking to scour their chambers with great chimneys that penetrate into the higher caverns, or even into the surface world, and then challenge themselves by building some of the largest bonfires known in Narvoth, congregating in rituals and feasts as often as possible. In fact, many clutches trial adolescent Xulgaths by locking them inside smoke-filled chambers for a time and bidding that they survive the ordeal to emerge as adults. These ideals of survival and hardiness are so important to Xulgaths that even average specimens are usually referred to as warriors by learned lawmasters. Personally, though, I find this term to be rather misleading, as a Xulgath warrior is, in actuality, rather tame by the clutch's standards, and unlikely to be given any task that may lead to conflict with outsiders. I mention this as a preface to an explanation of the well-defined roles in Xulgath society, which the Encyclopaedia Galarianensis relates to those of ants in a colony, only on a more intimidating scale. Clutches of eggs seem to hatch Xulgaths with caste-like modifications that dispose them to highly specialized roles proportional to the size of the group. Thus, despite the name, Xulgath warriors are more like workers and drones, though they admittedly demonstrate infinitely more independence on account of not being essentially a hive mind, with all the benefits and risks to the leadership that brings. The true scouts and hunters of Xulgath society are respectively the Skulkers and the bilebearers, who usually work together to stalk, subdue, and abduct prey back to their lairs for sacrifice and fresh consumption. Skulkers are distinguished from warriors not so much in biology as in behavior, as they tend not to cover themselves in the bile that is responsible for the distinctive Xulgath stench. In contrast, the so-called bilebearers are hatched with additional stomachs that lead to gill-like folds on the neck, each capable of producing an incredible amount of the putrid substance. This is an acid that quickly overwhelms the olfactory receptors in a victim's brain to render them briefly unconscious, though it is not strong enough to inflict any physical damage, for that would char the flesh too early. Instead, it is designed to give the Xulgaths an edge in subduing their target, trussing them up like a turkey and hauling them home. Almost all Xulgaths produce some through their skin. To them it functions much like an oil and even a fuel source, as it is slightly flammable. However, the bilebearers turn it into a potent weapon. Leadership of a clutch will often fall to a mage of some sort, either to a priest or natural-born sorcerer who slays their distant relative for the devourer title. The term priest is a little misleading, though, because Xulgaths do not construct churches or temples as we understand them, and they certainly do not understand the concept of an organized clergy. Instead, through rituals and foul magic around their bonfires, the clerics and shamans worship one of any number of abhorrent deities and demigods, most often the demon lord Zev Gavizeb. Luckily for the other denizens of the Darklands, the beast of Gluttondark spends much of his time asleep, and his waking hours are normally fueled too much by fury and feasting to bestow much more than simple boons to his followers in the material plane. Nevertheless, sometimes a demon will be summoned into the caverns to advise or even lead a Xulgath tribe, and thenceforth its fate is sealed into violence and death, for these are the only things demons accept. Sometimes, the Demon Lord of Caverns and Reptiles will instead bless his worshippers with a strange hatching, from which emerges a vile creature that resembles a hybrid between Xulgath and demon. These are called Slaugraks, and they are barely sentient, desiring only to kill, feed, and then kill again. Their handlers are frequently devoured before they have a chance to bring them under control, and Slaugrak rampages are often the catalyst for a change in clutch leadership. This chaos is, of course, all in a day's work for a demon lord. The greatest blessing Xevgavizeb can bestow onto a petitioner is to ascend them into a Deepmouth, which is the most senior position a Xulgath could hope to occupy. If the priest was not the clutch's devourer prior to this blessing, then they are always ceded the leadership soon afterwards. Deepmouths are distinguished from senior clergy through their ability to write in scale script, which is a mysterious text of great power. Through the manipulation of scale script, Deepmouths can produce magical runes onto the skin of loyal Xulgaths that can briefly reach into Xevgavizeb's realm of Gluttondark and lash out with its fury. Most often, this manifests as a monstrous, wispy green-black tentacle that erupts from the inscribed Xulgath's mouth to rip the life from its target. It is a rather disgusting thing to behold, but terribly effective in combat and in Xulgath politics, which are closely interrelated. Nevertheless, some Xulgath tribes, though these are a minority, I stress, second worship to their beast speakers, their term for druids, who by tradition are exiled in small groups to dwell at the edges of a territory's influence, living lives closer to the true troglodyte hermits of surface rumour than any other of their kin. The beast speakers are well respected, yet they alone among Xulgath mages exert little influence over their brethren, preferring to study the mysteries of the Darklands in peace and solitude. Robbed of direct magical oversight, but not of magic altogether, these clutches tend to hatch specimens that resemble true soldiers and warriors. The weakest of these, though still far stronger than most Xulgaths, are called the Spinesnappers, and they forego any semblance of tactical acumen in favour of unmitigated, bloody brutality. They are impossible to mistake for the regular warriors, because they stand almost twice as tall and often bear colourful frills that run down their necks and backs, not unlike horses' manes. These brutes are often accompanied by the Scale Riders, who are specialised warriors, often elite Skulkers, granted the great honour of riding reptilian mounts into battle. The giant monitor lizard or giant chameleon is the most frequent Xulgath mount, although occasionally a specialised Darklands serpent called a Galarok will serve instead. If a clutch keeps mounts, it is the job of the Scale Riders to breed and train them, as well as lead them into battle, which engenders a particularly powerful bond between rider and steed seldom matched on the surface world. The strongest Scale Riders are referred to as the champions of the clutch, and you would do well not to underestimate their martial prowess. The devourers of most large clutches normally occupy these positions prior to challenging the previous chieftain, but there remain a few caste roles that I consider even stronger on an individual level, even though they are almost always too specialised to lead a clutch for very long. The first is the Xulgath Stoneliege, which is the result of performing an inflection ritual normally reserved for stone on an unhatched egg. Called the Ritual of Stonebinding, it is a difficult and normally unsuccessful process reserved for those fluent in alchemy or magic, but its product is worth the complexity. The Xulgath emerges with scales as hard as the rocks themselves, and with an innate understanding of speleology and geology, to the extent that the very earth responds to their will. Stonelieges are obsessed with literally shaping the world around them, which Xulgath clutches put to good use, creating complex underworld structures far beyond normal means. In combat, a Stoneliege is a dangerous foe, because their physical strength almost matches Spinesnappers, despite being far smaller in stature. Warren Guards, meanwhile, represent the very best of a Xulgath tribe. While not as large as the Spinesnappers, they are considerably more competent through sheer relentlessness. These specimens are slow in wit, but unparalleled in their single duty, which they will perform even at the expense of the clutch devourer, to protect the eggs. Once an egg has been produced, it is brought to the warren and presented to a warren guard, who will inspect it for deformities or signs of weakness. If it is found to be unsatisfactory, the warren guards consume it on the spot. Otherwise, it is placed under their protection, and no other Xulgath, not even the devourer, is permitted entry. You may be able to infiltrate a warren, sneak past a Spinesnapper, bribe a champion, but you will never trick a warren guard. You can only fight it to the death. In a similar vein, the more extreme evolution of Xulgath bilebearers comes in the form of the so-named Gutragers, whose biology strengthens their species' trademark bile into a dangerous acid. Through modifications to the stomachs, skin, and esophagus, Gutragers are able to spit this acid accurately up to 60 feet away, and uncoil their own throats and tongues to lash at targets up to 30 feet away. The usual stench is replaced instead by a hazy mist, as the very air around them is saturated by acidic droplets, which are harmless to Xulgaths alone. In an emergency, particularly if the clutch is threatened by a stronger opponent, Gutragers are even capable of exploding in a spectacularly visceral sacrifice of gore and acid, hopefully thereby cleansing any threat in the process. Unfortunately, those born as Gutragers are always rather bloated and repulsive things, for their bodies sacrifice much in the name of acid production. Most formidable of all are the few Xulgath chieftains who rise above all others, the ones who can quell their own instincts to expel their distant kin and conquer all opposition, be it magical or martial, the ones who can blend strategy, strength, and luck in equal measure. These rarest of Xulgaths are called Tyrants, and they alone among their castes are not hatched, but self-forged. Once in a human generation or so, one will rise up to claim dominion over entire nations' worth of territory beneath our feet, instigating brutal wars against any and all who do not submit to their new order. Of course, their reigns may end as swiftly as they begin, but that does not stop Xulgath tyrants from being among the most feared of Darkland denizens. When a tyrant is on the warpath, no one is safe, even here on the surface, if there is a Darkland entrance too close to a settlement. These castes within Xulgath society hold true across all three layers of the Darklands, Navoth, Sekamina, and Orv, though most clutches today are spawned only within the top levels. Yet this was not always the case. About 5,000 years ago, the Xulgaths emerged from the depths of Orv, from a vault located beneath northern Garund, now called the Black Desert, but then known as Vask. This continent-spanning space was a primeval jungle of life and gloomy light, populated by creatures beyond count, including the progenitors of the Troglodytes we now witness. Indeed, the Xulgaths forged for themselves a great empire within that vault, and extended its tendrils up through Sekamina and even into distant Navoth, flirting with dominion over the surface world beyond. They erected ziggurats and places of worship in thanks to Xulgath, their demon lord patron, and saw Vask as a slice of the abyssal layer of Gluttondark here on the material plane. This particular vault was threatened by malignant Brightburn crystals, which glow curiously but punish any who come too close with sickness and slow, excruciating death. These were abundant on the ceilings of Vask. However, it was protected by 6 powerful artifacts called Eon Orbs, which nullified the effects of Brightburn and facilitated plant growth on a scale otherwise unachievable in the Darklands. Some scholars believe the orbs were the craft of the Xulgaths themselves, although there is no evidence for this, and to my mind they seem different in style and finish. In any case, not long after the Starstone Isles were raised from the sea, a god came to Vask and claimed 5 of the orbs for himself, rendering the vault vulnerable to Brightburn's corruption. Before long, the previously verdant jungle cavern was left a barren wasteland that poisoned all life that entered it, save a few tolerant creatures. Alas, the Xulgaths were not among them, and they were thus forced to abandon the vault in its totality, fleeing from Orv higher into the Darklands. Their empire soon collapsed, and their culture regressed the farther from their ancestral home they fled in space and time. Until today, they remember this period only through their art of inflecting stone. Some say that the deepest parts of Secca Minor still boast organized polities of Xulgaths, uncorrupted and free of this degeneration. They are led by Xulgath Thoughtmaws, who have psychic powers, fierce intellects, and long memories. Their skin does not produce foul bile, but odorless, psychogenic serum that facilitates their powers and protects their remnant nations. And they claim that the one responsible for the theft of the Aeon Orbs was none other than the god Aroden himself, who used them to create the Swordlands on Kortos, and to make the Isle of Erin equally fertile. He paid little mind to the peoples he displaced and to the nations he destroyed in so doing, for he may have believed that the single orb left behind was enough to hold back the inevitable Brightburn tide. But if so, then it is proof that even the god of destiny could not foresee all things. Regardless, the Xulgaths here on and under Kortos are particularly ferocious, perhaps due to being so close to their ancient, lost artifacts that likewise hail originally from beneath Golarion itself. Well, stranger, there we have it. The sad tale of the Xulgaths. How the mighty fall. The Aeon Orbs are real artifacts, by the way. They still power the towers that give this naturally barren rock we call Kortos its fertility. I will point them out to you when we journey on the morrow to Escadar. In fact, I think our journey to the Isle of Erin would seemingly elapse far more quickly if we passed the time poring over the maps and lore of the northern half of Kortos. The information we have is too thinly dispersed to justify on-site touring, but I would still like to cover the Swordlands and its largest town, as well as the dark marsh of Dunmire, as we sail into Erin's harbour. In which case, there will be no more gambling tonight for me. No, I will still need my wits and wallet about me come morning. So, this is where I must leave you for now, and I will look for you by Diobel's southern piers in the morning. Well, until then.